Well, thanks, Victor. As you can see, I'm here in my home studio, and like a lot of people, self-quarantining. So it's nice to get a break and reach out and talk to some people about music and recording. And Victor's been trying to get me to hook up for quite a while, and just our schedules never seem to gel. So, but as I said, I'm locked down here in Silver Lake in Los Angeles. So. I can't hear all of you, but you can definitely hear me, right? I'm getting lots of questions already, which is really cool. So let's just jump right in here. As you can see, as I said, I'm here in my home studio. This is called Grunge is Dead. I'm currently working on a new Garbage record. We luckily finished tracking about 2 weeks ago, so I'm just finishing overdubs and Shirley's got a few vocals to do, and I'm putting some ear candy and a little bit of arrangement things in. But basically, we're going to start mixing the record in about 3 or 4 weeks. So we're probably going to be mixing it from home in the box. Just that's what we're going to do. So, all right, let me field some questions here. There's a lot of them. Thank you so much. All right. Here we go. Butch, how would you describe the sound of 2020 as compared to the 70s, 80s? Ooh, man, that's a tough question. To me, production these days is really ambitious. It's borrowing elements from all different styles of music, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And everybody likes to blend those together. I mean, we've been doing that in Garbage for a while, but I hear that in pop radio now, where they're blending all sorts of elements from everywhere. And I think that's really exciting for producers and engineers and artists, because it's basically a wide open palette. There are no rules anymore, so you can put a distorted hip hop beat over a fuzzy guitar, over a chorus of angels, with traditional instrumentation, and you can chop it all up and manipulate the heck out of it, and it's all fair game. And I think that's why when I listen to radio, alternative radio and mainstream radio, I hear tons and tons of cool songs and cool production, and I think it's really an exciting time for music right now in the 2020. So how's that for an answer? Okay. Holy cow, a lot of questions. Let's see what we got here next. Okay. Hey, Butch, do you use amp simulators like Helix, Fractal, etc. on studio recordings, or just for live use with Garbage? Do you think amp sims hold up well against real amps? Yes, I do. I've used Fractal before, and I also have a Kemper back here. But I also have a Pod Helix. Where is it here? It's on the floor. I've got a rack mount on the floor. And I have a couple amps here at my home studio that I use. Billy Bush, our engineer in Garbage, has a ton of great boutique amps, more small ones at his studio, Red Razor in Atwater. And we use those all the time, too. But I'm not really a purist. I'll just use whatever's quick and easy, and whatever sounds good. If an amp doesn't sound good, I'll try a simulator. It just sort of depends on what you're going for. And I know a lot of guitarists still love to plug into an amplifier because they like to hear the sound of the guitar playing in a room. But as I said, I'm not a purist, and I'll use anything, anywhere, anytime, as long as it sounds good. So, do whatever works for you. Okay. Being from Wisconsin, this is from Pat Hunley. Being from Wisconsin, I'm from Wisconsin, by the way, thank you. Does working in the Midwest help or hinder your productions? I think when I started out as an engineer and producer, being in the Midwest helped in some ways because I was very isolated, so I don't know that I necessarily followed trends, if you know what I mean. Obviously, if I'd been in New York, I would have been lucky to get into a studio as an engineer, or in LA or Nashville, and really learn a proper way to record, because I never worked my way up through a studio, and I never went to recording school, so I had to learn everything kind of by the seat of my pants, very DIY. But I found that liberating in a way, because I didn't know what else there was in some ways, So I, like I said, being isolated, I think, really forced me to sort of just make it up on my own, and that's what I did. So, I think nowadays there's so many options for young engineers and producers. There's some incredible recording schools out there, and they're all really good. But I don't think you have to go to a school to learn. I think a lot of it comes from, like I said, doing it yourself, just figuring it out on the fly. Both ways work. But I'm from the Midwest. All right, another question. Mics versus the room. Is it easier to get good sound based on the room, or can mics give the sound you want regardless of the room? Basically, what's more important, mics or room? I think they're both equally important. Obviously, the sound of a good room can be a sonic temple. And when a room sounds good, your choice of microphone probably does not always matter as much, because the vibes you're getting from the air moving into the microphone are defining a lot of what the sound is. And obviously, the bigger the room, the more you hear that sound. I think if you're in a tighter room or a drier room, sort of like 70s dead style studios, it's probably better. You're going to hear the mic more, because the sound of the room is going to less influence what you're recording. But I think they're both important. And this also gets back to just what I said about being a purist. I'm not a purist when it comes to microphones. I have a really good mic collection, but I'm happy to plug in just about anything if it sounds cool. I don't have to use a FET 47 or a U87 or a U47 on everything. If a microphone sounds cool, just go with it. And again, I learned a lot of that from us when we started Smart Studios, because we did not have a good mic collection. In fact, it was most of the microphones were pieces of crap, but we used them, and they had a vibe, and that was the most important thing. Speaking of microphones, I want to show you this. I don't know if any of you know Tommaso Calavi. He used to work with Muse, and I worked with him on a Muse track years ago, and he's made this mic called the Periscope. And it's really cool. I've been using it the last couple of days. It's a shameless plug-in for him, but I love it. It sounds really cool. If I'm right, Tommaso, it's a Omni condenser with a really hot gain stage, so it sounds very, very compressed and loud. Like, you don't really need to compress it, because it already sounds compressed, but it's really cool. And it has a sound, and it's super vibey. If you can track one of these down, at least you should check it out, because it's really cool. And I've been using it on everything here, and I like it. Okay, another question here. I'll try to keep them a bit shorter so I can get to more questions. When routing more than one mic on one source to a recording track, common when using 24-track tape machines, how far beyond moving the mics and reversing polarity for stronger bottom end do you go? I check phasing quite a bit, because it can really screw with your bottom end if you don't have the phasing correct. I don't use 24-track that much anymore, so it's easy. You can actually flip the polarity in Pro Tools, and you can actually look at waveforms. If you've got a couple tracks up, like a kick drum or a couple kick mics and bass, you can look and see, are the sine waves spiking up or down. You can actually line things up to get the bottom end more correct. But back in the old day, when I worked on 24-track, yeah, I would check as we were recording, because if you're not careful, you can lose a lot of bottom end with bad phasing. So check your phasing, people. And it's easy to do that. They have little if you're not using Pro Tools, they have those little phase checker boxes. I don't think they're very expensive, and they're worth it. I used to have one at Smart Studios. So if you want to check your phase, get one of those if you're recording analog. Okay. Queen Mary 27. Hey, Butch, cheers from Brazil. Cheers back to you. Thanks for doing this. How do you compare electronic and acoustic drum kits when it comes to mixing? Well, the electronic kits, and I guess by that I guess you mean loops and things that have been programmed, like I do with Garbage. A lot of our tracks are half acoustic kits and half program kits using samples. Usually the sample kits are already compressed and tweaked out quite a bit. Live drums usually need a lot more finesse with EQ and compression and level riding, and they're usually a lot more dynamic, and that's why I sort of view them that way. I try to keep some of the dynamics from the live drums and some of the roughness or the looseness to them, because the program drums or electronic drums are usually much more precise. You know, in fact, I play a role in TD-50 live now. I have for the last couple of years with Garbage, and it sounds amazing. In my brain, I've got a lot of drum samples that are custom that I did here at my studio, and coming through a PA, it sounds incredible. And it's pretty much, you know, it's like a one shot every time, and so it's very consistent. It doesn't need any extra EQ or compression. When I used to use acoustic kits live, of course, it needed a lot of finessing by the front of house engineer and the monitor engineer to make things sound good. But they're two different beasts, and I think if you're doing acoustic drums, you know, in a mix, you're going to need to work on them more. Like I said, electronic drums usually are pre-processed before you get into them, so they sound pretty good. But in Garbage, we use both at the same time, and that can be a head scratcher unto itself. So I'll move on to the next question here. From Andrew. Hey, Butch, Foo Fighters' Wasting Light sounds more driven to tape than Nevermind does. Was this an artistic choice from you and the band? Yes, it was. We recorded really hot to tape, and when we mixed, we ran everything. It was all done analog. We ran everything back through an API board, and we hit the board hard. We hit the tape. We were printing hard. Everything has a lot of natural compression from the tape and the board, as well as James Brown, the engineer, had a lot of compression that he was using on individual tracks as we recorded and also as we mixed. But you can hear that in that record. It sounds like it's really hitting a wall, but it's all analog. And I think that's one of the things that's super cool about that record. I think it sounds very, very analog. Hold on. Let's turn this off, shall we? The other thing I want to say about Wasting Light is it made me realize that when you record to tape, it's all about performance. And I think Wasting Light is one of the best Foos records there is, because it's really, to me, it really sounds like them as a band. It's rougher, it's scrappier sounding, but those are pretty much performances. Well, there was no editing. You know, I did a couple songs where I edited tape, like between a couple takes, but they were just like blunt cut edits. But basically, that's the band playing, and I think that's why that record has such a cool feel to it. And that's one of the things about tape. If you use analog tape, you can't necessarily go back and fix everything like you can in Pro Tools. So when you can, if you get a chance, work with analog tape sometime. It's I know it keeps falling by the wayside, and there are a lot of purists out there who still love to use it. But if you've never used it as a digital artist or engineer or producer, you should try it sometime. It's fun, and it's a different vibe, and it's definitely worth doing. Okay, next question. Adam Richards, can you talk about some of the chosen plugins you use upboard for your mix bus? I'm also really interested in your vocal chain. Well, my vocal chain here, if you can see it, I'm using a Chandler LTD1 preamp, and I love the Summit TLA 100 vocal compressor. That's been my go-to vocal compressor for 20 plus years. I've used it with Smashing Pumpkins, with Garbage, with Against Me, pretty much every band that I've recorded, I love how that compressor sounds on vocals. I don't have a particular mic that I like to use. It just depends on what the singer's voice sounds like. But that's a big question in terms of plugins. I'm working on a garbage track right now, and I'm using the Fab Filter EQ on quite a few things. I love that EQ because it's really easy to grab and drag, and also you can see the real-time frequency response of what you're EQing. I'm trying to think what else I've been using lately. I like the IK Multimedia Compressor Stealth. I think it's a really good, if you want to maximize it, it's a really good compressor. I also have the FG Red compressor that I sometimes put on the bus. This is too tough of a question. Yeah, I've got a ton of stuff on this mix. Tons of things. Too many to mention. I have a lot of Echo Boy delays on this. There's a lot of sort of spaciness in this track, and that's one of my favorite delays. So maybe some other time I'll break down a song, just one song, and go through the whole thing and talk about the plugins and stuff, because otherwise I could talk for another 45 minutes on that. Okay, anyway, next question. Tons of stuff, you guys. Thank you so much. From Elizabeth McVeigh Green. Hi, sitting here in Viroqua, Wisconsin. Hello, Viroqua. That's where I grew up. Wondering about the best solutions for home demos, piano and vocals for the most part. Well, Elizabeth, I'm guessing you have some sort of digital DAW, right? So the main thing for home demos is just try to get a really good performance. I don't think you have to worry about it sounding like a Steely Dan record. You know, you really don't. The most important thing is to get a great performance. Also, really make sure the song is good. You know, work on the arrangement. Make sure it's really focused. I wouldn't worry too much about the technical end, the tone of the piano, and just make sure everything sounds good. But if it's going to be just vocals and piano, it sounds like it's going to be pretty simple. So try and just make a really good, clean sounding recording, and make sure you get a great performance. Okay, hold on. My thing is spinning here a little bit. Wow, okay, Fernando, if you had to pick one piece of hardware to improve the sound of an ITB setup that's in the box, for those who don't know, which one do you think makes the biggest sonic difference? Summing, mixer, clock, SSL fusion, hardware, compressor, etc. That's a loaded question. A couple years ago, my good friend Chris Testa, an engineer who I worked on with Jimmy Eat World, did a summing test, and he got about 10 different summing outboard things. So we ran them through all of them, and honestly, I could not hear any difference. I couldn't hear any difference. Sometimes I think a clock can make a difference, depending on what kind of clock you're using. And when I worked with the Muse guys, again, just referring back to Tommaso, there was some clock that they really liked that said was the best. Everything sounded great, but I think it was like $10,000 or $15,000, so I didn't buy it. I'm just using the clock in my Pro Tools, and it sounds good. So if it sounds good, I think it's okay. Tyler Stark, hey neighbor from downtown LA, tips for authentic 80s new wave. Oh man, 80s new wave. You got to get the vintage synths. I have lately been using a lot of the Arturia keyboards, and I think they sound incredible. The modeling is amazing. And if you don't have a VST, if you can get the real thing, which we have at Billy's studio in Atwater, he's got a lot of vintage synths there. They sound amazing. To me, that's sort of the definition of the 80s. It's more the synth sound, less about the guitar sound. But so plug in those synths, man. How can a clock sound good or bad, Connor? Again, loaded question. Some people think clocks can make it really high clear definition, but as I said, I have never really sat down and gone through all the different clocks. The Muse guys think they can hear it, and they probably can because they have damn good ears. But if your clock works for you where you are, I wouldn't worry about it. Sometimes as an engineer, you can get too obsessed about all the different possibilities. If things sound good in your working environment, don't go crazy and start looking for greener pastures because they may not exist. What is your most beloved piece of gear? It used to be the Roland Space Echo, which I love. You probably can't see it there, but underneath my Summit TLA 100 is a Roger Meyer RM. I think this is RM58. And it's a solid state compressor that I use a lot here, and Billy has one in our studio in Atwater. And I swear to God, you put that on a bus and it vibes it up, man. I don't think they make him anymore. We got ours for about $500, and they're probably charging way too much money now on eBay. So I'm not sure if it's worth it, but it's instant vibe. If you want to crunch something out and really sort of shred it up in a really cool way, the Roger Meyer is great. It's one of my favorite pieces of gear. The Rec Room, Butch, huge fan. I heard rumors about using a blue mouse on a snare and a blue Robbie for bass DI. Is that in your workflow? Sometimes I have used a blue mouse on the snare, but not all the time. Sometimes I still put a 57 up, or I'll put a MD80 Telefunken or a 451 AKG. Those are kind of my three favorite snare mics. Lately, I also used a Beyer ribbon mic on a snare because it cut out a lot of the hi-hat bleed. But they're all good choices, man. Uh, 221, Juan from Chile. What is your approach when you produce garbage? Can you separate functions, music producer at the moment of a record mix? Good question. As a producer, I'm usually working with another band, and so I have to remember it's their vision, it's their songs, their music. In garbage, I'm a producer, I'm an engineer, I'm also a drummer, keyboard player. I can select the wine, I can make the coffee. I'm a songwriter. I'm all these different things, so I wear many hats, and I like that about being in the band, that I don't have to be just one thing. And I feel like it's being able to bounce between those two things, being a record producer sometimes and then being in a band, have been a really healthy thing for me, because they're definitely two different sort of psyches in my head. And I like that. I think it's good. I think it's healthy. In terms of the technical aspect, garbage is an interesting beast because we don't have any set way of how we record. Sometimes songs happen really quick, but those are an anomaly. Usually they're quite a long process where we record, try different things, and then we see what sticks and what falls off the wall. It's like throwing paint on a wall and see what sticks. And usually by the time we finish a song, I'm working on a mix today, actually. Usually by the time we finish a song and I go back and listen to the early demo, it's changed completely. Sometimes it's a different key. It's the arrangement's all chopped up. Could be faster, slower. It may have started with guitars and now it's full of keyboards. There's no way to know. And it's just one of those things, the four of us, how we make decisions. It's a really interesting process. And so I never know where it's going to go. And I'm still not sure where this record's going to go, but we're going to have it mixed about a month from now. I hope. Fingers crossed. Baptiste Waymare, did you put samples on Dave's drums on Nevermind Please? I did not put samples on his drums. However, I think Andy Wallace did use a little sampling to embellish the acoustic sounds. Now, he says he didn't. And if he says he didn't, that's fine. It doesn't really matter. But I think he did add a little bit of snare, a gunshotty snare, and a little bit of a wallop on the kick that he was triggering from some sort of digital delay. But they were mixed way underneath the acoustic drums. So at the end of the day, that's still Dave's drums on Nevermind. Would you play a little of that track behind you? Let's see if it comes up here. Okay, it's kind of a mess right now. I love your mustache. Thank you. I was thinking of cutting it off the other day, but I haven't yet. What have you currently been listening to? Oh man. Last night I was playing Cigarettes After Sex. I love their last record. They have a new record coming out, which is lovely. I like Lana Del Rey's new record. I was listening to that last night. Hard for me to remember. I need to look at my phone or whatever to see what my current playlists are. But a lot of good stuff out there right now. Do you mix with a subwoofer? I do not mix with a subwoofer here. We have one at Red Razor Studios in Atwater. And man, is it a subwoofer. If you're sitting in the back of the room, it pins you against the wall. So we only put that on when we're trying to check if the bottom end is getting too crazy sounding. How's your shoulder, by the way? This one is healed up after surgery. It's still sore. It's doing okay. And I'm starting to get some pain in this one, and I'm hoping that I don't have to have surgery on it. I've been doing physical therapy. We'll see what happens. We're supposed to go on tour this summer, but I don't know if that's going to happen, obviously, with what's going on in the world right now. But if the tour does get postponed, hopefully we'll be playing later in the year. As everybody, that's, it's crazy out there right now. So I hope all of you are being safe, by the way, and hunkering down at home and recording cool songs. That's what you should be doing. Okay, some more questions here. Nuno, hey Butch, what does the future sound like? I wish I knew, brother. Howdy from Texas. When recording drums, are you spending most time tweaking, tuning, mic placement, EQ, and effects? Would love to hear your philosophy about this. I think the biggest thing is to figure out the style of how the drummer plays, first of all. Do they play really dynamic? Do they play consistent? Is the song noisy, a lot of cymbals? Is it simple sounding? Because if it's a simple part and there's not a lot of bashing, you can really bring everything up and open it up. And if it's a noisy track, you have to really sort of focus things and sometimes use gate or really use tight miking. I like to EQ quite a bit when I'm recording. Like I rarely record drum mics flat. I pretty much EQ everything. Sometimes I compress, like I might compress a snare mic or might compress the kick a little bit, but not always. Sometimes I'll wait till mix down to do that. And I like to compress overheads a little bit and room mics, and I'll compress the room mics a little bit when I record, but sometimes I'll squash the heck out of them when I'm mixing, if you want that kind of sound. A lot of that, though, is dependent on the drummer and the song, the style of the song. So you really have to sort of know, as you're in pre-production or even when you're the day you're tracking, what you're hearing coming through the speakers. And sometimes you have to adjust on the fly to make things sound good. Butch, can you show the Periscope again? Yes, very quickly. There it is. It's pretty awesome. And it sounds cool. Any favorite mistakes? Oh man, there's probably too many to remember. There's a couple things on this track we're working on where Steve and Duke played some crazy guitar stuff. It was just noise. They didn't even think they were actually recording, and we ended up using it in the song. Someone asked me about Stupid Girl the other day. There's this really glitchy sound in the B verse of that, and that's actually a DAT melting down. Back in the day, sometimes stats would just go crazy, and we were trying to play something back, and it made this weird sound. So we actually recorded that onto analog tape, and then ran that into a Kurzweil sampler, and triggered that and put it back into the song. So it's a very strange sound, but for some reason, I thought it sounded hooky, and I'm not sure why, because it's a pretty weird, glitchy sound. But anyway, listen to the B versus Stupid Girl. Stupid Girl, you'll hear what I'm talking about. It's a good accident. Sergio, why did the initial mixings and never mind the initial mixing? Yes, I did. Why were those discarded for the album? At the time when we were mixing Nevermind, I was mixing with Dave, Kurt, and Chris, and they were sitting over my shoulders and not making it very easy to mix. Kurt would come up behind my shoulders and say, "Turn all the treble down. I want the guitars to sound like Black Sabbath." And I would do that and say, "I don't think they sound very good." And he'd go, "Okay, we'll put some of it back in." Anyway, it was sort of, I was trying to mix, but when they were there all the time, the mixes weren't sounding how I wanted them to sound. And even though the mixes sounded pretty good, when the label called, when Geffen called and asked if we wanted to bring in a mix engineer, I was happy to do that. You have to remember, this is one of my first major label records. And I got a list with like 15 mix engineers on it who were all like really cool engineers who I respected, and I'm like, oh my God, I get to work with these guys. That would be super cool. And we looked all the way down the list, and at the very bottom was Andy Wallace, and his credits said Madonna/Slayer. And that's why we chose Andy, because he mixed Slayer. That's a true story. And the mixes sound great, man. He killed it. When mixing the box, do you ever run into phase issues when you're dishing the red, like your mix bus? I never do, unless you're running out of RAM, or you're using something that is taking up so much heat, causing you're starting to get latency in the box. I've never heard anything get out of phase, between mic channels. So. But I am conscious. I can hear if something starts lagging a little bit. It's usually because your CPU can't tolerate it. So you might have to change the CPU level, or use a different plug-in that doesn't use as much CPU. Get more RAM, whatever. There's several different things you can do. But yeah, I've never heard of any phase issue like that. Pedro, what's your biggest advice for someone who is now starting mixing, recording, and experimenting sounds? Try to come up with something that is totally cool and unique to yourself that you love. That sort of sounds like a cliche, but there's so much music being made these days, and a lot of it sounds great, but it is quite generic sounding. And part of that, I think, is because everyone's using a lot of the same DAWs, the same plugins, the same drum machines and samples and things. So in order to stick out, you have to do something creatively to really make people sit back and listen. And sometimes it's just the song. If the song is killer, that's probably the best thing you have going for you. But if you're looking at it from a sonic point of view, try to do something that gives it an interesting sound, or something that sets you apart from everything else. Because like I said, there's so much music out there now. We're just inundated with it. And a lot of it sounds amazing, but it doesn't all sound unique and fresh to me. So if you can find that uniqueness in something that's true to yourself, you're going to come up with something that sounds killer. All right. Hey, Butch from London, which producers do you rate? Oh man, there are so many amazing producers out there right now. I was just looking at a little bit of Sean Everett on Mixed with the Masters, and I think he's an absolute genius. I grew up listening to a lot of producers who were doing music in the late 70s, early 80s. I love Todd Rundgren. Chris Thomas. I love Chris Thomas. I mean, he did the Sex Pistols and And that first Pretenders record, which just sounds so cool. It doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard. So producers out there now. And it depends on sort of the genre of music you're listening to, but I think it's refreshing. Like, this is sort of going back to what I was saying earlier. There's so many cool sounding tracks on the radio right now. And a lot of them I hear and I go, damn, I wish I'd thought of that. But I do hear things to me that are inspiring. I think that's a really good, healthy thing that's happening right now. When this virus is over, we would do a meet and greet for people, and of course I would. Let's get the damn virus. Let's get rid of the pandemic first, shall we? Yeah, Mix of the Master, Sean Everett. It's really cool, man. He's awesome. My favorite 5 bands. Well, I love the Who. That's what if you go on where I get coffee in my den here, there's a bunch of photos up of the Who. That was the first rock band that I sort of fell in love with, and I was like in 6th grade or 5th grade or something. I wanted to be Keith Moon, and sadly, I'm not Keith Moon. I play more like Ringo or Charlie Watts, but that's okay. I can still love Keith Moon. I love Pete Townshend's songwriting too, and I just thought the band, they were one of the most incredible, dynamic live experiences I'd ever seen. Luckily saw him play live a couple times. I got to see Keith Moon before he passed away. Yeah, I love the Who, but that's just one of thousands of bands that I love. How do you make sure an artist is ready before you record them? It's a good question. A couple of things happen for me before I take on a project. I like to meet with the artist and sort of have more of a social get-together and just sort of pick their brains in terms of who they are and how they function, what they like. Talk a little bit about their record and the music. I want to sort of get to know their personalities and sort of what the vibe is like between them. Producing is like 50% psychological. The other half is technical. And, you spend a lot of time, very intimate time with people in the studio. I think it's really important to get to know them and understand the dynamic of how they work and how they interact as people. The second thing is I want to hear the songs and get an idea of what the songs sound like in demo form, or even if there's something that they're currently working on that we might just take and finish. I also want to know what their vision is. I like working with bands that have a very strong vision. When they sort of know how they want things to sound. I'm a better producer when I understand what that band wants to do. When they're scratching their head sometimes and asking me to come up with a vision, while that can be exciting, it sometimes can be more daunting too, because there's a path you want to steer them down, So, and sometimes I've had to do that, and it's usually worked out for the best. But I like working with bands that have a very strong vision. Do you use upward compression expansion much to change your RMS, or do you mostly downward compress? Mostly downward compress. Every now and then I'll upward, but not very often. I mean, sometimes I'll use a transient designer to sort of make things pop out. Normally when I compress, I just downward compress. I do a lot of riding too, in mixing in the box. I do a lot of gain stage. I'll set the compression so it sits in a pretty good place, but I do a lot of riding on the individual channels to get the dynamics. Also with the buses. This is one thing that someone asked me about a couple of weeks ago. Do you guys know what tiering is? I call tiering. I'll take a VCA and put it on the subgroups. Say I've got a session up with a bunch of aux faders like drums, bass, guitars, keys, vocals, and then I take the VCA and all the subs, and I'll on like say the start of the verse, I'll run it up 1.5 or 2 dB. This is pre-compressor. but you'll hear the jump, and then I slowly tear it down over 4 bars or 8 bars, or sometimes really quickly just to get a spike and pull it back down. I usually try to find a place where I can pull it back down where you don't notice the volume is coming down. And then by the time the next course comes around, I've got another 1.5 dB gain I can hit. And so if you look at the waves, it's like these little, it'd be like, like, does that make sense? Anyway, Billy Bush and I do it all the time in Garbage and other projects. It's called tiering. And it's a great way to add dynamics to your mixing. I'm sure a lot of people use it and they maybe call it something else, but that's what we call it, tiering. Greetings from the quarantined Italians. When you're tracking a live band, where do you set your meters at? I usually keep them at 10 dB, but I don't know. But it depends on where we're recording. I don't always look at the meters that much. I usually work with engineers now and let them worry about the meters. I use my ears. And I've also realized sometimes I have to look away from Pro Tools, look away from the screen, because you can get caught in looking at waveforms and seeing anomalies or things that maybe don't look right when actually you should just be using your ears. So I'll move around, I'll move around the room. I don't want to necessarily get too stuck in the technical aspect of it. I prefer just to listen. Now, trust me, I'll go hardcore technical. I'll get in there and tweak stuff and go into nano editing if I need to, and I do sometimes. But when I'm tracking, I prefer to just sort of listen to the vibe and see how it's affecting me from an emotional standpoint. And I rely on my engineers. I rely on Billy Bush to make sure everything is being recorded properly. Do you prefer to track drums on tape or straight to DAW? Pretty much lately, I've been going straight to DAW. Obviously, with the Foo Fighters, we went to tape. The whole record went to tape. I'll tell you a little story. When I did 21st Century Breakdown with Green Day, they were pretty adamant they wanted to record to tape. So we set up a A/B on day one, set up analog tape, 24 tracks, and digital, and matched the levels exactly. You could hit A or B, and we had them track one song, and I brought them in to the control room and said, okay, A or B, flip it back and forth. They flipped it back and forth about 10 times, and they went B. That was digital. So we record everything digital. True story. Can you articulate an experience you thought was bad but turned out okay when an experience that you thought was bad but turned out okay when producing records? I don't know. There's, I have some. There's a lot of stories I could tell, but I don't really like to go too deep down that rabbit hole. There's a certain doctor-patient confidentiality when you're in the studio with someone. I could write a kiss and tell book someday, but I have really good relationships with almost all the bands I've worked with, and there wouldn't be much point in me kissing and telling. I'd be burning too many bridges, and I love all those artists anyway. So I do remember a track once. I can't even go there. No. Not today. When I write my kiss and tell book, I'll put it in there. Do you use sidechain compression? Yes, I do. More on the drums. Sometimes we'll sidechain it to get a pulse going between. We'll let the drums or the kick drum sort of dictate throbbing in a mix or pulsing in a mix, much like some of the EDM or club tracks sound like, but not a whole lot. It depends on the track and the kind of effect you're trying to get. I do. No, not really. I do like to run multiple. Like I'll split the drums out to different stereo buses, and sometimes I'll sidechain compress the second set of drums, so they do kind of crazy stuff, and they could be triggered from just the kick drum or snare, or they could also be triggered from a bass or some other instrument, sometimes a sequencer keyboard, which can do odd things to the drums and start to make them move around or pulse in a really interesting way. But I do that less for rock tracks and more for electro sounding tracks, if that makes any sense. What do you use in your master bus? So I sort of talked about that. I don't really know. Like I said, lately I've been using, well, for one thing, I still use that Massey 2007 master limiter, which I think sounds really good because it's really neutral. I also use the Stealth IK multimedia compressor, which I think is a good maximizer. It's really very transparent sounding. You can get a lot of gain out of it. If you want to get loud, that's a whole other thing, loudness wars. I sometimes use a compressor, and sometimes I'll put an EQ on. I don't have a particular EQ, but maybe I'll add a tiny bit of top end. Usually if I put an EQ on the bus, I'm cutting some low mids somewhere between like 200 hertz and 500 hertz. Even if you just take it down a couple dB, it can really open up a mix. Sometimes I don't do that on the master bus. I'll put that on individual subgroups. Like I might put it on the guitars and cut some of the low mids, or I might put it on the keyboard tracks. I also on the mix on the guitar subgroup and the keyboard subgroup, I usually put a low pass filter or a low cut filter, high pass, whatever. I cut the low end usually around somewhere between 90 and 150 hertz, depending on what the songs sound like, just to sort of clean up a lot of the extra muck that's going down there. And I think that can really tighten up your mixes too. But I don't usually do that on the master bus. I do that on the subgroups. What's in your API lunchbox? Well, I have probably can't see it, but there's actually a lunchbox down here. This is the lunchbox over here is for tracking when I track stuff here at Grunge is Dead. And I've got APIs, Helix, a Levelor, some Harrison. I love the Harrison EQs, particularly their high and low pass filters. At Smart Studios, we had a 232 channel Harrisons that we soldered together. So we had a 64 input mixing console, analog console upstairs that I did a lot of work on. We did the garbage records on that. I did tons of projects on it. And I love the EQs, particularly those filters, because when you sweep the high and low, there's a bump on either side where you cut the frequency and it boosts it. They're really musical. And if you listen to garbage records with so many tracks, pretty much every channel went through those, and we'd find a particular area where a particular part had a very specific frequency and not a lot above that or below it. And that's how we were able to get so many different elements, so many tracks and bits of music into a mix. Anyway, I have them here. I use them on, it's a hardware, it's hardware EQ, but I also have the plugins for the Harrison filters. I like to use those a lot too. And I've got a little Devil compressor I use on the snare. Pretty minimal. I think I have 6 inputs here for drums, so that's all I need. I usually do kick, snare, sometimes a bottom snare, but usually just 2 overheads. And maybe I'll mic the toms if I feel like it. And sometimes I have a vocal mic in here. I'll turn on and pick up tracking in the den just to pick up some of the room sound. But it's the studio here is very it sounds like a den. If you look in the other room, it's it's a rectangular room with drywall, and it sounds like that. So I usually have to, with the room mics, I have to cut some mid-range out just to sort of soften the room because it can get pretty intense sounding in there. But it works. There's a lot of drums. The last 2 garbage records, that most of the live drums were done there in the den, and in my pajamas, by the way. That sounds good. Would you consider doing a deconstruct the mix on something from wasting light? I'd have to clear that with the foos. I don't know if Dave still has the multi-tracks. He may have destroyed all those. I don't know if you know that. I know the mixes. I know he cut all the tape up. I think he did it with the 24-track too. James Brown, the engineer, kind of freaked out, but Dave started cutting the tape. And then I think the first 100,000 people who bought that CD, there was a piece of tape in the CD. So, and there's no digital backups, as I remember. There's just the one master that we made, and that was a specific. That's what Dave wanted to do. So, I don't think it's possible. Sorry. Any tips on deciding when a mix is finished and not overworking and letting things go? That is a tough question, and sometimes I am guilty as charged of going too far. Sometimes the mix is done when there's a deadline or when the budget runs out, you know. I can be kind of tweaky sometimes with mixes, and I'll hear little things, anomalies and stuff that start to bug me, and then I get really over-focused on those sometimes. I guess it's sort of my ADD personality. And does anybody really care about the little hi-hat thing if it's up 2 dB or down 2 dB? Well, I do. So sometimes I get kind of tweaky on those things. But in Garbage, Shirley's the one who puts her foot down. She goes, "That's enough. The mix sounds good. Just finish it." And she doesn't have the patience to do the endless tweaking that Duke and Steve and I do and that Billy does. So God bless her for putting her foot down. And she's about to put her foot down about 1 month from now. I think I got it. Victor, a few more questions, right? About 5 minutes or so. This is fun, you guys. Thanks for indulging me. I'm sitting here holed up. I'd be happy to do this again sometime if it works out for everybody. Anyway, let me get a couple more questions here. I have not tried the Harrison DAW, but I've heard it's really good. And as I said, I'm a huge Harrison fan. I love the sound of those preamps and EQs. I do like deadlines. Deadlines can be good if they're not too quick. Which bands you currently produce without a click track, or is it a must? You know, you don't have to use a click track if the band and the song feels like it doesn't need it. I got a text not too long ago from Rivers from Weezer, and he said, "Mr. Vig, do we have to use a click track on everything?" I said, "Not really. If you don't want to use a click track, don't use one." It just depends on the song and how you want the song to feel. I don't know if you guys know this, but I use tempo maps a lot. Like we used to click when we did Wasting Light, but what I did was in rehearsals, I listened to a song and I would say, okay, the verse is really good at 156 and the chorus actually feels better at 152. I would go through each section and on my iPhone with a little BPM thing, tap in the time. And then I have an old school analog drum machine, which doesn't have a click. It's got a shaker and a tambourine. So it's very forgiving. It's like shh, 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 versus a tick, tick, tick. And I think it's better to play to because it moves a little bit. It's not quite as precise as a click track. And then what I do on the fly is I'd feed it to Taylor, and on the fly I would speed up, and it makes you get a little nervous, you know, because I don't want to screw it up. I'm going from 156 to 160, and then the bridge is 163, and then I got to go down to 152 or whatever. And so if you listen, the songs speed up or slow down, but the tempo map is designed to follow where they play live. So they're in that pocket where in the rehearsals where it feels really good. And we do the same thing on some of the Garbage tracks. There's tempo maps sort of based on how Cheryl sings or the feel of the drums and the guitars. And, sometimes we slow choruses down, not necessarily speed them up. On the last record, Empty, we worked on a demo, and it was all one tempo. And as we were finishing the song up, it didn't feel very good to me. Duke and I came back to my studio here, and he played guitar and I played drums, just the two of us, and just played the song with headphones on, with no vocals, just sort of feel. And we did like 3 takes. And the third take felt pretty good. So then I came in and I timed out where each section was. And yeah, it was like one section felt good at 118, one was at 122. The drum fills, by the way, were all sped up. And so then the next day I went in and I gave Billy Bush a huge tempo map, and he had to take the song that was already done and cut everything to 113, 118, whatever. But then the song started feeling more like if we played it live. And I wish I had done that when we started the song. It would have saved Billy a half day of editing. But anyway, the track turned out pretty cool, and I'm glad that we did that because it has a much better feel for that. The new Garbage record is coming out. I don't know. Probably the way things are now, probably very early in 2021. But we'll be done with it in about a month or so. What means being a good producer? I talked about this a little bit before. It's half psychological, half technical. And by technical, I mean arrangements, sonically, making sure the mix is good and the performances are good. But a lot of it, to me, is the psychological aspect, trying to get inside an artist's head and make sure they're comfortable and making sure they are making wise decisions. You're getting great performances, that they feel comfortable to let their hair down and try things sometimes that they maybe wouldn't want to do. And it's important, I think, for me anyway, to establish a really good rapport with who I'm working with. I want them to trust me. So if I suggest something, they're at least game to try it. If they don't like it, that's fair enough. But at least I want them to be open-minded enough to try it, and that comes with trust. Okay, one more question here. Let's see. Is there a deconstruction that smells like Teen Spirit? I think there is. Years ago, I did a Nevermind classic records thing. You can probably find it on YouTube. I'm sure you can. I remember doing it. We did that at Smart. I can't remember what it's called, but if you look, you'll be able to find it. Any experience with tube traps, George? I've used them in the past. I've got a couple traps up in the room here, but not tube traps. There's one trap on the wall here. There's some ceiling cloud baffle things. There's some on the back wall. I don't have any tube traps near, but they can work really good. If you're having a problem with your room with the bass, you might want to look into them. Okay. I'm going to do one more question here, and then I will sign off, y'all. It would be great to do more Mix of the Masters. One of these days, I'll get it together. I'm going to try to go to France and do a whole week there with y'all. I don't know when that's going to happen, but we'll try to get to happen at some point. What's the best advice you received when you started out in music production? One of the bands I was in before Garbage, I was in a band called Spooner with Duke from Garbage. We played post-college in Madison, Wisconsin. We were sort of a new wave pop band. And we wrote a lot of our own, we wrote a lot of music. We put 3 or 4 records out in an EP, a couple singles and stuff, and pretty much did our own producing. But the first record we did with a producer, Gary Klebe, who was in a band called Shoes. They were a brilliant pop band from, like a guitar pop band from Zion, Illinois. And they put out a record called Black Vinyl, which they did in a 4-track in headphones, which is just genius. And that got them signed to Elektra Records. They did 2 or 3 records with Elektra. There's actually a great book on Shoes that came out that I read last year. I think Moira McCormick wrote it. If you can track that down, it's pretty interesting. Gary produced the first Spooner record, Every Corner Dance, and he knew that I was more interested in production than just being a drummer. And he literally said to me, I can see you're interested in this. Don't put your eggs in one basket. Don't just be a drummer. Learn how to do everything. And from that, he meant just don't learn to produce and engineer. Learn how to do every single thing. I started learning how to play guitar. I play guitar, not very well, but I play guitar, bass. I played piano when I was younger. I can play keyboards a little bit, not well, but enough to sort of get through a song and figure out chords, especially when I'm working in an arrangement with a band. And I tell that to a lot of young producers and engineers, that don't put all your eggs in one basket. There's a lot of things out there, a lot of opportunities and paths that you may go down. And if you decide I'm just going to do hip hop music, that is great, but you might sort of limit yourself. And there's so many things musically you can do, from sound design to engineering to live music to mixing to writing songs to doing commercial work to doing film and TV. All those are really interesting. And like I said, if you think you're going to go down one path, you may want to broaden your horizon, because you may have multiple paths you can go down, and you never know where that career is going to take you. So I encourage you to keep your paths wide open, and look for as many interesting paths that you can travel. That's what I would do. Anyway, I got to sign off. Thank you so much, everybody. And we should do this again, right? I hope you're all safe. As you know, I'm quarantined here, as everybody is in Los Angeles, or trying to be quarantined. And let's do this again sometime.
Thank you so much, Butch.
Peace.
Thank you. And see you, everybody. Don't miss our next webinars. And thank you so much, Butch, for doing this with us. Thank you very much. See you next time.